Hello, good morning, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Help a Charity Brand Success History. My name is James O'Neill. I'm the Head of Marketing here at Video, and I'm delighted you could all join us for what is going to be a very lively discussion. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers today, Lauren, David, and Chris. Welcome all.
Hello. Hello there.
Hi.
And each will be presenting on different areas, and I'd like to remind everyone you can join the conversation as we go. Please do use the chat box to ask questions to our speakers. We will have time for a Q&A at the end. You can also reach us on Twitter, LinkedIn, email, etc. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Lauren, who's going to kick us off. Lauren.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jake, and hi, everybody. I'm happy to be joining you. So just to introduce myself, my name is Lauren. I'm one of the co-managing directors at Shape History. We are a social impact communications agency. We've been going since 2015. What's unique about us is we work to essentially nurture social impact leaders. By social impact leaders, this can be anyone from the charity sector, which is the main topic of conversation today, individuals, foundations, etc. And we like to nurture them and propel them using our skills in strategic design and communications to essentially accelerate social impact to the max. We also understand that there is such power in authentic partnerships. And together with all of our partners, we like to amplify stories, mobilize communities, and we channel movements through our bold communications. So without further ado, how I like to spend my session this morning is essentially running through our process that we take when we work with any of our charity partners to build their own brand. Essentially, this looks like something like this. So I'm going to walk you through our process, and the first stage always is understanding. And this is to understand and to discover you as a charity, your market, your audiences. We then move on to the articulate phase, and this is very much to do with your verbal identity. So it's really understanding kind of your attitudes, your values, what you believe in, and your brand strategy. I'll then move on and speak about design. So how can we take that verbal into more of a visual and exemplify your brand implementation, your visual identity, and your brand story. And lastly, we activate the brand. And usually, and from experience working with some of our charity partners, we get to sort of that design stage and we're like, oh my God, we need to activate now. So it's really coming up with a sort of plan to do that. So if we take the first step, this is understand. It's understanding you and your market, your audiences. The first stage, whenever we walk into one of our partners' rooms, is we sort of scope out exactly what they're looking for. What from the brand needs changing? Why are they going through this process? And it's really just diving a little bit deeper in understanding who they are. We'll then take a strategic planning technique and use this to identify any strengths of the current brand, any weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We'll then look to do a brand audit with our partners, and this is more focused on creative. So we're looking at sort of the existing colors, the logos, etc. We also tend to look at the back end of their website if they have one already. We look at the Google Analytics, where is most traffic coming from, things like that. We then move on and we conduct a competitor analysis. And I want to make reference, although I've used competitor analysis, I know we're speaking for the purposes of this webinar about charities, and I really hesitate to use competitors because I feel as though if you're all working towards the same things, you should be doing so in partnership. That's besides the point. Moving on to stage 5 in our discovery process, we hold stakeholder interviews. So these are interviews both internal and external, and it really focuses on that verbal language. This is where we get our richest sort of data and insights. We're coming in as an external agency. We don't pretend that we know everything about our partners and their brands. It needs to come from them. It needs to come internally and it needs to come externally. Lastly, and I'll go on to this a little bit later, but we do a lot of work in persona mapping. So the purpose of these sort of stakeholder interviews and the understand stage, the first stage, is essentially to audit the charity brand's ecosystem, to establish how close our perception matches the way it's perceived both internally within the charity and also externally by stakeholders. So by answering sort of any questions that perhaps people within the charity may not have really asked themselves before about their existing brand, it will sort of give them a first initial insight into sort of how we need to develop the existing verbal and visual identity. So just to go into a bit more detail around personas, hopefully this isn't sort of a new concept to you, but for those of you that it is, we use these principles, and it's really stemmed from behavioral psychology and neuroscience, and essentially it maps out any audience that we're trying to target, emotional drivers. And we do this through stakeholder analysis, interviews, and surveys. So as you can see here, and this is sourced by Lab Lateral Limited. So we have our monkey, we have our lion, and we have our dog. A monkey typically represents that desire to be aware and to be recognized, to be really included, and they fear exclusion massively. You can sort of recognize these people in potentially head of foundations and institutions. They seem to be quite high up in their career. We then move on to a lion, and this is somebody who you may recognize in something like, you know, a head of external affairs or head of comms at a charity. And they have a real desire to be competent and to achieve their intentions, and they fear not being good enough. We then have our dogs, and we might be able to recognize these through our peers or maybe through sort of a younger generation, but essentially they're incredibly connected to their community, to their teams of work, to their peers, and they really fear rejection. I've seen this more typically around sort of people like social media managers, but also in terms of sort of activists and sort of those campaigners who love to get outside and sort of protest, that sort of thing. So I provided an example here of how one might want to map out a persona. So this is Fiona the funder, and as you can see, we've started to chart out her behaviors, her motivations, her fears, and her goals. And this will really inform personas that can be used not just as part of this rebrand, but also just more widely within the charities and within different departments. As well as looking at sort of more intrinsic and emotional motives, we also look at habitual attitudes. So what sort of things do they read? What magazines are they looking at? What TV shows, etc. We have a lot of fun with this at Shape History, actually. So you might recognize that personas are used already within the charity sector, but what I have found, speaking to a lot of our partners, is that they're not actually properly being used so well. What seems to happen is a lot of our partners, you know, might create a persona a couple of years ago, and then they'll be stuck on the wall for about 2 years and nothing has changed. What's unique about personas is they are not unique. They constantly evolve. They're constantly changing. No person is the same from when they were 18 to when they were 25. And this is based on things like societal factors, people's development, etc. So once we've sort of completed our understand or discovery phase, we've sort of gained that internal and external input. We've looked at how our perceptions and sort of match our projections. We now need a defining attitude. And this moves us nicely into our articulate phase. So a defining attitude, this essentially is your soul and your essence of the actual charity. It's that constant that drives the charity in every area they work. And I provided a few examples on the next slide. So you might recognize these. This is Apple, Think Different. You've got Patagonia, Planet Before Profit, and you've got the Obama campaign, Yes We Can. These are essentially all defining attitudes. So you'll find out the brand strategy, which is the next stage. It will include things such as your defining attitudes, as I say, which within that is a set of values and your sort of brands or your charity brand's foundations and principles. A lot of this needs to be developed in the research that we conducted in our understand phase. It's not something in our understand phase that we sort of just research and then we lose. It goes in every single aspect of when we're building this brand. There's particular focus within the brand strategy as well on that sort of competitor analysis as well to see how your other charities within that space are speaking and sort of what their brand looks like as well. So from here, once we've sort of established a brand strategy, we can move on to our brand story. And our brand story is the emotional narrative that evolves essentially from this framework that you can see on the right here. Once we've established that, we can move into the design phase of taking this verbal into the visual. And as you can see here, we have a lovely diagram that our creative team designed. So thanks to them if they're listening. You can see from the inwards to outwards, we've started with our sort of defining attitude, our defining purpose, which leads into our brand strategy. And you have things such as your audiences and your personas, your values, your tone, your positioning, your messaging, which nicely leads into our brand story and finally our brand implementation. And this is where the visual comes into it. And equally, within our brand implementation, you have things such as your social strategy, your digital, your branded content. So these are things like web, video, logos, colors, etc. Everything we've done from the strategy and the story feeds very much into the visual. And when it comes time to actually activating and launching, it's really a constant. You deploy your brand to start, you then start to observe how it's doing, how is it being received by those stakeholders we spoke to at the start, how is it being perceived internally. We then interrogate and we sort of see, does anything need tweaking, and then we refine. And this is a constant. Charity brands have to constantly adapt and change depending on what's going on for them, what their stakeholders need to see, and equally how it's perceived by everybody else. So that's a little bit of a summary. I know we're doing questions at the end, but I have also seen how many people have joined this webinar. So if you do want to get in touch separately, I know that Jake will provide my details. So thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Jake.
Brilliant, Lauren. Thank you so much. That was what a whiz through how to develop and deploy a strategy. That's excellent. There will be time for questions, and we will have contact details at the end so people can get in touch if they want to follow up with you. I'm going to now pass over to a couple of lions, I guess. David and Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm David Hamilton. I'm Director of Comms and Marketing for the Scouts.
And I'm Chris James, Brand and Ambassador Manager.
Fantastic, and we're so proud to share the story of our brand with you this morning. We launched it in May 2018, and we're just coming to the end of our transitional period where we've got all of our sites on brand. So I'd like to start by saying, well, why is it important? Why was it important to us? Well, the number on the screen, 168,000, that's how many charities there are, and that's thousands of social media accounts, websites, and messages, and our challenge was to stand out among the noise and increase our reach, our relevance, and our reputation. So that was what was driving this change. Just in case you didn't know, a few stats about the Scouts. So we deliver skills to life to 460,000 young people around the UK, and we're supported by another 160,000 adult volunteers. So we're the largest youth mixed movement in the UK, and we've been around, as many of you will know, because you may have been through this yourself, but 113 years of heritage. And importantly, we've got 60,000 young people on our waiting list because we don't have enough adult volunteers to run the programs for them. So what was our challenge? Well, unfortunately, we were stuck in the 90s. And this came out in the research that we'll talk about shortly as well. What you can see on the screen now is our old brand. It was 20 years old. It was designed for print and before social media existed. And over time, it started to fragment. So across the nations and locally, people adapted it beyond really what you could recognize as a brand. We also found that we had a burning platform. So this is what happens when you've exhausted your existing support. So you have this burning platform that you have to do something about. We wanted to reach out to new and different people and energize them about the Scouts. So we conducted some research, and some of it was quite sobering. So here you can see only 47% of people believe Scouts as relevant to today's society. And some of the comments we got back, clearly showed that people thought we were a thing of tradition or a thing of the past, something from the 90s, not really up to date with technology, and not something that people could see on a regular basis. Our first big breakthrough was highlighted through our research, and it reminded ourselves why we do what we do. And this was discovering our benefit, which is skills for life. So we're giving young people the skills they need to succeed in life. And we tested this really, really carefully, and it, from all the other propositions, showed what would make us more supportable, what would make us stand out, and something that rang through very importantly with not just the public, but actually our own volunteers, the young people that take part in Scouts, and our staff team as well. So, if there's one thing that I learned from this process, in fact there's three things, but it's engage, engage, engage. So we're a movement of 640,000 people, and we had to take them on a journey. So that involved loads of research, loads of conversations, updates, webinars. We gave monthly calls to our key line managers, who are the people who could make change happen on the ground. And we built a project team made up of volunteers and staff from across the UK. We also made sure that our senior leadership team, our board, our senior volunteers were bought into this from the start, and they understood, firstly, why it was so important that we needed to do this, and secondly, that they were engaged throughout the process and understood at each decision point why we were doing what we were doing.
Thanks very much, David. Now, one really big insight for us was that, as well as the rational part of our brand, which was Skills for Life, or the actual take-home benefit, we found that equally important was identifying the emotional effect of our brand, so the emotional side, what you feel, which we identified as that sense of belonging. So Skills for Life is what brings people in. Belonging is really what keeps people scouting. Now, that drove the kind of the brand essence, but obviously a really key part of this process was looking at our visual identity. Now, we have this incredibly iconic logo, this symbol we call the fleur-de-lis. We've had it for over 100 years. Now, what do you do when there's so much brand equity tied up in that? And the answer is make it digital. So make it a lot bolder, simpler, something that works much better on mobiles when seen at a really small size. But of course that comes with risks and difficulties as well. So we have, as David said, we've got 160,000 volunteers. A lot of them are very, very conscious of our history, and change is unsettling. Now, fortunately, we ran into a brand consultant called Baden-Powell, who some of you will know is the founder of Scouts. And we found that actually way back in 1908, he drew the first ever kind of Scout logo, which you can see on the left there. And actually it bore an uncanny resemblance to the one that we introduced in 2018. So we were able to say, look, we're actually going back to our roots. We're going back to something simpler. And sharing that timeline really kind of helped people understand that this was kind of evolution and not revolution. But I think as part of the brand, you could see there that it feels much more youthful, more dynamic, brighter, bolder, much more representative of a youth movement. And when it comes to life and applications, and especially on mobile, digital, it really feels much more contemporary. So you can see there kind of our brand at a glance. You can see how that Skills for Life is what we talk about, that what we convey is that great sense of belonging. You can see that set of colours. We introduced a font that was a Google font, so that was free and open to all, but very, very accessible as well. And to help give our nations a distinct identity, we assigned a set of colours to the different nations. So much more of a kind of a family feel to our brand, a single family rather than really fragmented family, which it was before. It works incredibly well online, on social. And one tool that we found really, really valuable to our members and also to manage the brand was an online brand hub. So we call it our brand center. And it's free for members to log in. They get templates, they get access to all our videos, logos, everything you could possibly need, and they can adapt things locally. So one sort of other big decision we took was to launch our brand and strategy on the same day. And we know that it's incredibly important that your brand and strategy is really closely aligned. Your brand is a vehicle to take your strategic messages to your target audiences. So we took this big decision. It was a huge day for us. Nobody got much sleep the night before the 18th of May 2018. And in the morning, it was just really worth it. We had all our members getting excited about it. We had our ambassadors supporting it. We had our video being viewed hundreds of thousands of times. It was, a great day for us and a real kind of year zero for Scouts. But we haven't just given up. We didn't sort of rest on our laurels. We wanted to embed that message about skills for life, and we've run several campaigns focusing on individual skills like empathy, active listening, resilience, and that's really helped kind of the public really understand what we mean by skills for life.
Okay, so we're 2 years in, and already we're starting to see some great results from the brand. So overall, our membership is on the rise, which is great. We've had particular increases around girls and young women, which actually, when we did our research initially, lots of the UK population didn't know that girls could join Scouts at all. Our relevance shot up by 13%, so we measure that regularly. And 82% of our volunteers said that they'd actively support the rollout of the brand, and this has increased over the past 2 years as well. And now our brand is shared by 8,000 groups and all the nations right around the UK.
Just as important as our kind of visuals and our kind of brand essence actually were the words that we use, so our tone of voice. And we realised that, for this new contemporary, more youthful brand, it had to sound different too. So we've got a tone of voice now which is much more conversational, much more relatable, more informal and grounded. So actually when we talk about skills, we don't just kind of list those skills that you might see on a CV, teamwork, resilience, independence. We talk to people as people, so we use conversational language. And I think that's now really borne out in some of the kind of the ads and things that you see. So rather than saying initiative, we say thinking on your feet. And rather than kind of confidence, we talk about speaking up. So it's just using those everyday words, everyday phrases, and we find it's just really, really effective and really speaks to people. And, we've had opportunities for out-of-home advertising and, that combination of our great identity and tone of voice all working together, I think, is very powerful.
Thanks, Chris. So just in summary, a few things we've learned before we play a short video. So focus on your benefit, so what it is that what you do, your purpose, I suppose, of the organisation, and most importantly, what people benefit from what you do. Avoid brand speak as much as possible. It's a real way, particularly in an organisation like ours, to turn people off the project completely. Create a diverse team to steer the project and have a good team of influencers. In our case, we worked across the nations and across different parts of the UK, so we had champions in all those areas. Engage senior leaders and stakeholders throughout, and that's not just at the beginning, at the end. So tell them what those key decisions you're making along the way. Create a self-service culture. This is really important from our perspective. We've got 640,000 people and literally just a handful of people at our headquarters. There's no way we could serve all of those people and support them all individually. So therefore, from the outset, we were thinking about how do we, what kind of guidance, what kind of resources do people need that we can provide centrally to help them serve themselves. Offer great tools and resources. So Chris talked about our brand centre, social media icons, logo designers, just stuff that's really simple for people to get access to. And remember that the words are as important as the visuals. So people will automatically lock on to logos and branding, sort of the visual branding, but actually just remember that how you talk can be just as important. Right, we're just going to play a short video and then we'll have some time for questions. Thanks, Jake. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, both. That was wonderful. Again, like a real fly through how to activate your new branding. That's incredible, especially with so many people on board. We have questions coming in thick and fast. Don't forget you can ask via the chat window. We'll try and answer as many as possible, but we will follow up any afterwards to make sure everyone's questions get answered. Guys, if we could start with you, I think we have a question here that's on a lot of people's minds. Was how difficult was it getting the members and local clubs on board, especially when the previous brand had started to adapt and be used in different ways locally? How difficult was it getting them on board and then keeping them to brand guidelines, I guess?
I think the most important thing is to give them lots and lots of warning. So just say that we're starting a process, we want to speak to everyone, we want to give everyone an opportunity to have their say, so that people are part of the co-creation of the brand. You know, the brand shouldn't be something that's just cooked up by the comms team and put out there. It has to be something shared. So by the time we got to launch, you know, a lot of people kind of shared the ownership of it. You know, it wasn't a huge surprise.
Excellent, thank you. I have a question here, Lauren, if you could take it. Someone that's got a very limited budget, and I guess it's quite common in the charity sector, but what areas should they prioritise first when thinking about their branding?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We face this challenge a lot, considering our partners are largely in the charity sector. If you look sort of back at the process that we follow, a lot of it, to be honest, doesn't need a huge amount of budget. So if you take sort of the understand and the articulate phase, that's very much verbal. The only thing I will say is often when we come in and conduct a lot, it is often better to bring in somebody external, just because we find that people are a lot more honest compared to if they're with sort of people within their own teams. So I would say put a lot more emphasis on that actually understanding and articulate phase to come up with some really great verbal messaging. And in terms of the visual, you don't need to spend huge amounts of money. I think bring somebody in who can really focus on sort of bringing you into a certain direction, and then potentially, if you have in-house or maybe a freelancer, to actually take on that work, because they'll be much cheaper than an agency.
Excellent. So someone to focus on the insight rather than on the activation side of things.
Exactly.
You can hopefully do that. Perfect. And a question, I think, for both guys, but both sets of presenters. But Lauren, if we start with you again, how are you measuring relevance for any of your clients once you do your branding?
Really good question. So a big part of what we do is actually measuring impact. So that's not just with branding, it's sort of any campaign work we do, absolutely anything at all. I think what's important is at the very start of the process to sort of set yourself kind of goals or KPIs that you want to achieve. I think when it comes to a brand that's slightly more difficult, I would suggest the external stakeholders that you spoke to at the start, go back to them again at the end, see how the brand's being perceived, actually go and ask people. And then there are more sort of obvious ways, such as looking at, you know, Google Analytics, seeing how many people are actually going onto your website, that sort of thing.
Excellent. And David and Chris, do you have objectives before you did the rebrand? Obviously, a lot of information came out of the insight stage, but do you have objectives and then you're measuring against those following the launch?
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of that specific question around relevance, so we sign up to a charity benchmarking survey, which benchmarks our performance against other similar charities. So that helps us. Sometimes just getting a number on its own is not particularly helpful, but when you can see how you're performing against your peers, that can be useful. We also use a research agency called YouGov, a national research agency called YouGov, and they test various things with our key audiences. So we've done quite a lot of audience segmentation, and we go out to representative groups of those people around the UK by age, gender, whether they have kids, and assess things like relevance with them as well. Obviously there's a cost that comes with that, but we think it's really important to track the performance of the brand, which was a significant investment for us.
Excellent. And David and Chris, come back to you, because Chris, you talked quite a lot about tone of voice. Do personas, I'll probably come to you in a minute, but do personas and tone of voice, do they affect how you respond as a crisis? or is there a separate set of rules for crisis comms outside of the standard brand framework?
Yeah, I think you've got to have a tone of voice which is flexible enough to cover, the fun stuff at one end, but also really, really serious stuff at the other. The key, I think, is for it to be grounded and relatable. So that works, grounded and relatable works equally well when you're dealing with crisis comms as it is for kind of recruitment. I think it's got to be authentic and a believable voice, but most of all, it's got to feel kind of people to people. That's what builds trust.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. And Lauren, are you using those personas? Do you have them for stakeholders that you might contact in a crisis? The press? Do you have other people, the public, that you would be serving on behalf of your clients? Do you have those personas in crisis comms?
Yeah, so our strategists do a lot of work in crisis comms, actually. This is somewhat separate to personas. I would say the difference is when we're speaking about personas, it's more speaking to your actual audience. And as the guys from the Scouts said, it's all about that emotional connection. When you're talking about a crisis, we usually sort of come up with a plan, before that crisis actually happens. It's about the tone of voice you use. I think the most important thing in a crisis is to ensure everybody within your organization is speaking the same tone. There needs to be consistency. That's the key thing.
Excellent. We've got time for just a couple more being signalled at. With the Scouts launch, what did the actual launch rollout of the revised Scouts brand involve to ensure it gained traction and recognition?
Great. Okay, so we had a full day of activity around the launch, and in fact that went on for some time afterwards. What was key for us is lining people up in advance, so making sure that key people locally had access to tools and resources, things like our main website, making sure that was available. There was essentially a timed plan of the day when certain things would go live, when messages would go out to people. We engaged with all our celebrity ambassadors in advance, so the likes of Tim Peake, Bear Grylls, people like that, to make sure that they were teed up and would be sharing content on their own channels at the right times. Essentially, the most important thing is that we've got 8,000 groups, 160,000 volunteers, and making those people the amplifiers of our brand, giving them the tools, the time, and the resources they need to do that, and encouraging them to take part during the day.
Perfect. So it's about activating your stakeholders, your internal stakeholders, to make sure they're all on board before you. We've had a couple of questions. I think this will be our last, but I try and roll a couple of questions into one. People asking about social media and best practice to build on social media, whether it's because you're a volunteer-run community group or quite a small charity, or perhaps you just want to increase your brand presence on social media. So what's best practice for you and what you advise for people on social media?
Yeah, really good question. I think this kind of comes back to really strategizing and understanding, firstly, what your plan for social media is, who you're trying to target. I would definitely suggest not to sort of spread yourself too thin. A lot of people sort of say, oh, we need a presence on every single channel. If your audiences aren't on every channel and that's not your purpose, don't do that. If your focus more is on Twitter and engaging in conversations, focus on there. Start to understand who your audiences are on that specific channel. Also test language. I mean, to see what works. Test different types of content. Video may work better on places like Facebook. You might want to be a bit more out there on Twitter. It's just about understanding the specific channels and also understanding the audiences on those channels.
Brilliant. And Chris, you're talking about how well the visuals for the Scouts landed on social media. Were you taking into account different channels, as Lauren said, to get your messaging right across those?
Yeah, I mean, we work across most of the social media channels. We've got really, really large Facebook following. We use video a lot. But the key for us really is using our own members as amplifiers. Our members, because we've got so many of them, they're great sharers. We encourage people to share, and really that impact kind of radiates outwards. So yeah, absolutely vital part of the mix, social media for us.
that is all the time we've got. We will make sure all the other questions do get answered. And you can also contact Lauren if you'd like any more information off her. Her details are on the screen now. I'd like to thank Lauren and Chris and David for joining us. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome. And thank you to all our audience. A recording of this webinar will be sent out to you very shortly. So we hope you can join us again next time. But for now, thank you so much and goodbye.